Thank you, Heather. As Heather mentioned, I work for the Center for Archaeological Investigations at Southern Illinois University. And the talk that I'm giving today relates to some of the work that we've been doing with the Mark Twain National Forest since 2015. We've entered into a cooperative agreement with them that allows us to go out into the field and in the field document some of the trail segments that they have running across their property in the Poplar Bluff Ranger District. And specifically, that's a segment of the trail that relates to the route that was taken by the Binge Detachment. Let's see if I can get this to work from here. There we go. The Center for Archaeological Investigations first became involved with the Trail of Tears in Southern Illinois. We've been doing work there for a while, but really some big cooperative projects came along in 2012, and since then we've been working with the National Park Service, the Shawnee National Forest, the Historic Preservation Agency in Illinois, and the local Trail of Tears Association to document a number of properties associated with the trail in Southern Illinois. And that's resulted in a number of those properties being nominated to the National Register. So up here on the screen, I've got pictures of Campground Church, the Bridges Tavern in Hamburg Hill, which our director, Dr. Mark Wagner, had nominated to the trail very recently, or to the National Register very recently. And we've also created a GIS layer. So Kaylee Sharp, who has worked for us, has worked with Dr. Wagner to do archival research and develop a GIS database that has a lot of the cultural resources associated with the trail on it. And that work led to the Mark Twain National Forest being aware of the work that we do on the trail and invited us to come over and do some work on the other side of the river. So in 2015, I became involved in the project. Myself, along with some other students at Southern Illinois University, began to undertake a kind of a broader project than just the Trail of Tears. We first entered into a cooperative agreement where we were working to document historic tramways in outside of Bunker, Missouri, and in addition to the tramways, we also agreed to look at the trail in the Poplar Bluff Ranger District. And even though they're not related, they have similarities. So the tramway lines, those are also they're kind of abandoned lines that run through the forest. So we kind of undertook this project envisioning the methodology behind it to be very similar for both of those. So for both projects, it required that we go out into the field during the fall and winter months. So after the leaves had fallen off of the trees, that's the best time to start to identify some of these things, because they can be very subtle. They're difficult to see, especially in areas where they're not maintained for public viewing. If you walk out into the forest, and I'll show you some images that really, I'll have to point out where the trail is. It's difficult to see, even when you're out there in the winter. But even when there's snow on the ground, that can kind of help, because you can see the relief a little bit more. Some of the swales and the ruts that come along in the ground can help you identify where that trail was coming through. I also like to throw this picture of myself up there because it looks like I'm actually out there doing real field work, and I don't get to do that as much anymore, so it looks like I'm wandering around in the woods trying to find things. Before I go into the specific trail segments that we did, I wanted to talk a little bit about roads and trails in general, and how they're an underrepresented or underutilized cultural resource for archaeologists, especially. I think a lot of archaeologists recognize their importance, but oftentimes if we find a road in the woods when we're doing survey, or if we see an old abandoned trail, we recognize that as a means to an end. It leads to something else that we're going to record. So we may look at that as a part of the site, but not a cultural feature necessarily in and of itself. There are some notable examples, the Trail of Tears being one. But it's important to think about these things as being cultural modifications of the landscape. And you can have cultural meaning associated with them. So today we might think of certain roads as having status associated with them. So like Rodeo Drive I have up here as an example, or if I were to say Michigan Avenue, I think most people would recognize that as being associated with wealth and status. People who live in those areas or who shop in those areas have money. But roads can also be associated with memory. So when we think of like Route 66 in the United States, that harkens back to a very specific time in this country. And we have kind of this shared collective memory of what that road means. So there is meaning behind just the road itself. And then we also have deep memory associated with some trails in this country. So like the Natchez Trace, for example. These can go back thousands of years. And the meaning behind those resources is deep. It relates to descendant communities and their ancestors, and it's more than just a trail that's leading from one place to another. The trail itself has meaning. So I think they're important for us to record and talk about and document because it helps with the preservation of those things, and it helps for individuals to have a deeper understanding of what a modified landscape is all about and how that can enhance our understanding of the past and how it kind of brings the past to the present. So many of you have probably seen a map like this. This is a graphic that I developed from the National Park's GIS layers that shows the different trail routes that were taken by the Cherokee in 1838, 1839. And there are a number of different routes that were taken to Indian Territory, and the one I'm focusing on today is the Binge Detachments route from Alabama into Tennessee and into Kentucky, and then ultimately into Missouri, Arkansas, and then to Oklahoma. That route was traveled between October of 1838 and then and they arrived in January of 1839. I won't go into too much of the history of the trail itself because I really want to talk about what it looks like today, because that was the focus of our research, what it looks like on the ground. But I will cover a little bit about how they got there. So the knowledge that we have of the Binge Detachments route is spotty. We have documentation. People have done research and found documents that relate to where they may have crossed at certain ferry crossings, or if individuals encountered them on the trail. So we can follow them at certain places, but between those points, we know less about where they actually were. So when they left on October 4th, one of the first places that we see them is at the crossing at Gunter's Ferry, and that's around October 10th, 1838. And then several weeks later, they cross the Tennessee River again. So Gunter's Ferry is crossing the Tennessee River, and then they move on. By November 2nd, they're crossing again, this time in Tennessee, at Reynoldsburg Ferry, or Landing, excuse me. From there, another few weeks pass, and they're at the Iron Banks in Kentucky, which is on the Mississippi River. And they take 10 days to cross the Mississippi River, with the last groups arriving in Missouri on around November 25th. This route that they take kind of up and around the boot heel next, in part is due to flooded condition. So I don't know if you guys can necessarily see that from the back, but we're following the line up here. So after they pass the Mississippi River, they go up to Jackson, Missouri, which is right outside of Cape Girardeau. And this area of the boot heel at that time was relatively swampy, so it was difficult to go directly across. So taking kind of that northern route up to Jackson was how everyone would have to travel at that time. And then from Jackson, they go to the Arkansas border, and they cross at Hicks Ferry, which is down here, and that's by December 8th. So they spend about 2 weeks in the southeast part of Missouri, and that's where I'll be focusing the remainder of the talk. After that, they're at Smithville, Arkansas on December 12th, and then finally onto Indian Territory in Oklahoma by January 11th. So the area in southeast Missouri that we're focusing on specifically is the route from Jackson to the Arkansas border, which passes through the Poplar Bluff Ranger District. And we're not the first people to do research in this area. There have been numerous studies that have been done. Probably the most detailed of these has been the work by Rusty Wiseman. Rusty gave a talk at the national meetings, I think it was in 2011, discussing how he did extensive archival research to track down the route through this part of Missouri and where these people would have gone. He relied on a number of historic accounts. First, he looked at the GLO records for that area of Missouri to identify where historic roads would have gone. He also looked at a number of historical documents related to people's journeys as they're going through that area. But probably the most important one for this particular route, which comes from just beyond Cape Girardeau down to the Arkansas border, was a survey done in 1837 for the state road in Missouri. That survey was done in relatively good detail. The Cherokee moved through that area. So we have information from that survey that tells us where the different farmsteads were along the route, exactly where the trail would have crossed section lines, and where it came through. Rusty also looked at the postal maps for this area too, to see the mail routes that were going through there. And what he wound up with was a refinement of the line that was projected through this part of the country. So the Binge Detachment's route, once they got to Jackson, this would have been the main through road down to Greenville and then on to the Arkansas border. Part of this route is an ancient trail from St. Louis to Natchitoches, Louisiana, and that through route was probably maintained as part of the state road. This goes right through the Poplar Bluff Ranger District, which is right here. We'll zoom in a little closer. And this red line now is the projected route that Rusty came up with for us. And he's provided this to the Forest Service and to us to help assist with this research. And the Forest Service, or the National Forest in the Poplar Bluff Ranger District, as with many areas of the country, is a discontinuous forest. So you can see these green blocks. These are actually the land holdings of the Mark Twain National Forest in that area. So the trail comes through the Ranger District, and crosses onto public land and then back onto private land, and it's kind of spotty throughout here. So we were tasked with using the information that Rusty developed for this line, and then going out and identifying where that would cross the Forest Service's property. And in each of these areas, we put people on the ground and surveyed to identify those locations to see if there was actually segments of the trail remaining. Now, some of that had already previously been done. The Forest Service had done a Passport in Time project several years before we got involved with this that looked at, that did a relatively extensive trail documentation of one long segment. And they identified a relatively intact portion of the trail and ran a GPS coordinate line through the center of that trail. Their methodology was probably the best that had been used. Some other surveys had identified portions of this trail when they were looking for other archaeological resources. So there may be a survey going through a portion of the ranger district where archaeologists are out there and they're trying to identify other cultural resources, prehistoric sites or historic sites that were in the area, and they may just happen across an old historic road. In those documents, they're mainly just noting its presence. They weren't documenting it in the same way that we have for this study. So we looked at some of the previous research that had been done, incorporated some of their ideas into our own project, and came up with a methodology to use when we were in the field. So the first thing we did was we took Rusty's projected line and we developed a series of field maps that we took out with us. And we went out during the fall and winter months to make sure that we could see this on the ground. We used a variety of different GPS devices when we were in the field. We would use handheld GPS units to get us in the general location of where Rusty's projected line may have been. If there had already been a portion of the trail identified in that area, we used that information also to get us close. And then when we were on the ground, we just kind of crisscrossed back and forth until we could find what looked like a portion of the trail that we could start to walk out. We used iPads, so we were taking photos and recording information directly into a database, into electronic devices, so that we'd have all of that information available to us when we got back after we were done recording these things. And we used this is called an RTK. It's like a GPS system that gets centimeter level accuracy. We would set this up once we had a known segment in place, and we would run down the center line of the trail in order to get a really accurate location for where the center of each section of the trail was. That allowed us to not only define kind of where the center was, but we also followed the outermost. The trail will split in some instances, and you'll have multiple branches. So we'd follow the outermost branches of those as well. So we gave the Forest Service at the end of this project a really good idea of where the trail is running, so that they can use that in their maintenance and their management of the trail. We also stopped at a variety of different points along the trail. If there was something that where the morphology changed, if it split, if it got deeper, where it entered the property, where it left the property, and we would physically draw maps of what it looked like in those locations. So beyond just taking photos and beyond relying on all of the electronic devices I was showing you, we would be in the field with maps, hand drawing what we saw on the ground. So we may draw the modern road that's coming through, and then show the trail cut that's going off, and then show other features that are along the trail. So this particular one, there were several depressions along the edge of the trail. We noted that. And we provided that information to the Forest Service so they can use that to go back and target those resources that may be next to the trail. Some of these things may be related to historic farmsteads that either go with the earlier, like the 1838 journey through this area, or they could be prehistoric features that go with the more ancient use of this trail. So we've documented their location, and more testing can be done at those spots. Another thing that we were doing when we stopped is we would put a line level across the trail and measure down and profile to get the depth, so we actually can see what the segment looks like in profile should something happen to it, and so that they can so the Forest Service can use that to monitor the condition of the trail. They can go back out to these points and say, okay, are we experiencing more erosion here, or has there been damage to the trail in some way, or how deep is it at this point? Some of them are relatively shallow, so if they're going out trying to relocate some of these segments, it's useful for them to know that information when they go out there, that it might not look like much. So we provided them with all of that information as well. Okay, so now I'm going to run through each of the segments so you can see what it looks like on the ground. And we'll start at the top. So this, at the northern end of our project area, this is an area near Greenville. And this is Lake Wapapello here. There's several creeks that feed in through this. So the Forest Service property, there's two large sections through here that the trail cuts through, and then it departs before it hits any of the creek crossings. This is a close-up of that area, and the red line that you see, that's where Rusty projected the trail would come through based on the archival research that he did. And then our data shows the trail running almost identical to where he's showing it here. So it comes through and matches very well in this segment. At the far eastern end, when it first enters the property, it's fairly visible. You can kind of see a swale here through the forest because of the little bit of snow we had when we were out there. That does make it a little bit more visible and easy to see. Let's see if... So it's coming right through the middle there. This yellow line kind of representing what it looks like. And many of these segments were continuously used after the Cherokee came through in 1838. So one of the things that you might notice here is that still looks like a bit of a road. It's clear through the forest. Even when they replanted this area in pine, someone was still using this road, or it was still a trail at that time, so the pine trees are not growing in the middle of the trail. So that would be well into the early part of the 20th century that was still in use. Through that segment, it rejoins multiple times a modern forest road. So there's a road that comes through. You can see off to the side here. Let's see if I can... Oh, that doesn't really match up with where I had it, but over on this side, the trail's coming through as it approaches the road. As it descends into drainages, it takes a much deeper erosional cut, so it's easier to see in those areas. It's much more visible. When you are out there, these are some of the first segments that you can recognize as you're in the trail. And the way that we would identify those more difficult to see segments would be to look for something like this and then walk, and then just keep following that until you get to these segments that are less visible. And then again, as we get back down into the low-lying areas, you really can't see it quite as well. But there is a wide, low swale that goes through as the segment leaves that portion of the Forest Service property. And even in those areas, we would stop. This is one of our employees, Andrew Van Cleve, out there mapping that segment. So we'd stop and check the depth at that point, draw maps, and take photographs. And then it would leave the Forest Service property. All along that segment, we identified artifacts that are related to the road in some way. Now, this is a 20th century dump, a bottle dump, and there were tires there, but this was right off the trail. So we know that this trail was in use well into the 20th century. We recorded things like this that may give some information to the Forest Service about where historic land use was happening. But we can also go back to those areas and see if there's an older component that goes along with that site. So those sites were identified. We found a number of bottle dumps and refuse sites that relate to either the late 19th or early 20th century. And then we also found a number of rock piles right along the trail. So they're stacking sandstone along the edge of the trail. We don't exactly know the reason for this. It could be field clearing. There could be something else going on with marking the edge of the trail, but these were right at the edge of the trail. So moving a little bit farther south, here we've crossed an area where there are a number of creeks on this northern edge that come through. And outside of Forest Service property, there's a very deep cut where the trail fords one of these creeks. It's right next to a cemetery. It's very visible. But then as we move down into the Forest Service's property, here they're coming up through a drainage. Now when I say drainage, it's if you're not familiar with the hills in the Ozarks, it's like a hollow or it's a natural runoff for water. So on these maps, you've got ridges where those are the high points, and then these natural runoffs make a convenient place to walk up to that high point. So this makes sense that the trail may be coming up through here and then crossing, can't tell, crosses a bit of a saddle. It comes up and across the ridge there and then back down into another drainage. And here we found a fairly tight fit again with Rusty's projected line. He had good data at this point on mail routes that were coming through, so the postal route. This is at the edge of a section line, so we knew exactly where that came through. And we could see it on the ground there. Now we get a little deviation at the south end, where it's not exactly on where he said it runs, but it's not far off. And coming up through that drainage, it is not that visible. It's fairly overgrown even in the fall, and very slight. You can only see it when you're on the ground. There's a slight rise to one side here that you can kind of make out in the photo, but for the most part, it's one of those things that you have to be there to see it. Now this approaches a county road that's well maintained after it comes up, and the projected line goes right down the county road. And I thought that perhaps the road had obliterated it entirely at this point. But I did find a segment paralleling the road, so you can see there's a swale there, and it runs right along the side of the modern road, so they just moved the road off to the side. And then after this approaches the road, it crosses, and that's where it deviates a little bit. But we found things like this on the other side. This is a depression. It was water-filled at the time, but this could be a collapsed cellar or cistern that's right off the side of that trail. We marked things like that while we were out there. That could be a farmstead that goes with the earlier component. So it could date to 1838. We gave that information to the Forest Service. So things like this would be areas that I would recommend they go back and do additional research. Okay, moving farther south. Here we have a pretty straight shot on that projected route. And we see a bit of a deviation up at the northern end where that comes in. It actually seems to follow the county road a little bit more. And again, it's going through natural drainages as opposed to coming down. This is a ridge spur that we looked all over the place. We couldn't find anything going down that. So we walked a little farther over, and then we identified, I think we were down in the lower area before we actually identified a segment of the trail, and then we walked it back up to locate the end of it. And it is relatively shallow, the trail at this point, but fairly wide. And we're mapping these segments again. Can't really make out what's going on there, but that, as we're leaving the property, you can still see a slight trace as it exits Forest Service property. Now, along that trail, and this may relate to the prehistoric placement of where this trail comes through a bit, there's an extremely large sinkhole. This probably doesn't show up that well in this photograph, but this is about 50 meters across, so it's really large. I've got one of our archaeologists standing on the other side of this trail in this shot, and you can't really make him out, he's so far away. But the sinkhole is right along the edge of the trail, and throughout throughout much of Missouri, there are prehistoric sites associated with sinkholes. So we noted the location of this to make sure that the Forest Service knew that that was there. It had not previously been identified. And I'm going to back up a little bit here. By this point, we're pretty far off the beaten path. So, oops. Doesn't want to stop. That sinkhole is half a mile from any trail. So it's at the far end of this project area. It's down in here. So a lot of the trail segments are off the beaten path and they're well protected. I don't know if anyone's been back in that area, maybe for hunting, but definitely not for hiking for maybe 50 years or more. It's pretty overgrown. As it passes the sinkhole and leaves the property, it's very slight. The only way that you can really see this at some points is down trees will be crossing the trail, and you can see there's like a little gap below the trees where the swale shows up. You can see that in the distance too. So as you're walking along, you have to kind of look for things like that to identify where it is. And we're walking along the center of this the entire time, trying to get a GPS track. Okay, moving a little farther south yet. Here we have another good fit for Rusty's line. And this is the segment, I believe this is the segment that was recorded by Passport in Time volunteers. This is right along State Highway 49 in Wayne County. And they had previously documented this pretty well, but we went ahead and we went through and redocumented the entire thing using the protocol that we were using, so they had all of that data complete. At the beginning, it's coming up through a drainage. It's relatively difficult to distinguish from the natural water flow at what would look like a creek bed at this point. So this is actually the trail. It looks like an eroded creek channel. But as we moved up and followed that, we could see that there were portions of the trail that began to deviate from that line. So we knew that what had happened is as the water had drained off and the trail had been abandoned for some time, the natural water flow through that drainage just followed that trail route and started to erode it out more. This segment, like I said, has been well documented, and all through that area they have site tags on the trees there. So that the Mark Twain National Forest, they tag their sites using these metal tags on the trees, so they can relocate these things. This is what the highway looks like that goes through there. It's obliterated part of the trail through this segment when they put that highway in, which it's only a small segment that's missing, but it does kind of crisscross that highway. And then as it leaves that segment, or that section of the property, it goes into a private pasture that we couldn't go out onto, unfortunately, but you could see that it's continuing. And then as we go a little farther south, here we're crossing the Wayne and Butler County lines in the Poplar Bluff District. And this approaches the Black River. There are 3 segments that come through here. We've got one on the northern end that comes down this ridge that follows Rusty's projection pretty well. And then when you get to the river itself, the trail became a little bit more difficult to identify. There is a cemetery that is maintained today. It's called the Military Crossing Cemetery. And the trail goes around the edge of the ridge here. It approaches the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and the railroad has cut through the trail and obliterated portions of it. You can see the trail cut come right up to the railroad and then come out the other side. But it gets a little confusing as you get down by the river exactly where the ferry crossing would be. There's a couple of segments that are likely. So up on that ridge towards the northern end, again, the soils are not very, they're not very thick in these areas. It's pretty rocky in the Ozarks, and there's not a lot of relief. So these things don't get eroded out very deeply when they're up on top of a ridge. So it's very hard to make out much of a trail cut through these areas. But we did identify segments. And as we'd approach things like roads when we were coming through, it became a little bit more obvious that we were on the trail, so we could follow those sections out. And this is what the railroad coming through that area looks like. It's scenic, but unfortunately it's destroyed much of the trail that comes through there. That railroad went in the mid 19th century, so it was after the Cherokee came through. And it looks like it's been maintained and updated since then quite a bit. There was a lot of debris related to the railroad surrounding that area. And this is what it looks like when you get down to the Black River. And historically, there were 2 ferry crossings on the Black River. There's one in section 10 and one in section 11. Now, the Forest Service property is in the in the eastern section over here, and where I have circled, that's where we found trail cuts that lead right to the river. In 1837, when the state road came through this area, that's where the ferry crossing was. So I think that what we've identified there is the trail leading up to that ferry crossing in 1837. When the GLO maps were made, the ferry crossing was in this western section, and it's likely that that was still in use at the time, so it could be that they took both routes. When the Binge detachment was coming through as a large party, by the time they got to Missouri, they'd swollen to about 1,200 individuals. So coming through on these ferries, if there were two crossing points, they probably would have used both. But this is on private land today. The landowner, actually, we encountered him on this road, and he said that we could go out and look in his pasture. So we went out and poked around a little bit. I did not see anything, but I didn't have time to spend on his property while I was out there. But he did seem open to people doing research out there at some point. He has cattle out there at the moment, so it's mostly pasture. Okay, and then moving south below the Black River, here is Rusty's projected route. And this is the final segment that we can see in the Mark Twain National Forest. It comes up a drainage, and then it comes down a ridge. This is a section of the forest that they call Cane Ridge, where they have a large wildlife opening. And then it comes back down into a drainage, and there's private property that it kind of passes through at the bottom, at the southern end there. What we found was a pretty good fit. There are other roads in this area that have been marked as trail segments previously. And when we were out there, we took a look at them and felt that they probably were not roads that were used at the time. The one that really kind of didn't feel right was a road that follows this creek bed going north and south. And it falls right along what would be an old property line. It goes almost too north-south. It seemed to go right along where a fence would go at the edge of that property line. So we suggested to the Forest Service that although it's recorded as a site, it probably was something that was put in later when more landowners moved into this area. What did seem more, let's see if you guys can see the archaeologist. She's back there. That's Ayla Amadio, who works with us. She's mapping a segment. She's on the ground. There's a lot of hunting that goes on in this particular area. They burn this off occasionally to keep the invasive species out, but for the most part, this segment seems to be relatively hidden away in this wildlife opening. So relatively difficult to spot, but it is there. And then once you come down off the ridge, the segment becomes a little bit more identifiable. You can see a swale coming through here in this segment. And then it again exits the property boundary. We went a little farther south than that, but the last area in the very southern part of the Poplar Bluff Ranger District, there's a segment that runs right along their property line, and it's actually on a private property segment. So that's the last part that was on National Forest land. So what we ultimately identified is that throughout the Poplar Bluff Ranger District, on all of their parcels, there are intact segments. So all of the areas where Rusty projected the line coming through, we found segments of the trail, and it remains intact. So it is there. And our recommendation was that these meet the qualifications to be added to the National Register as official segments. So we recommended that they do that. We provided them with GIS data for this project. we identified 12 segments in total, and that equals about 9 miles of trail segments. So all of the ones that we recorded in total are about 9 miles long, which is just a small fraction of this trail, but it's pretty significant that they have been able to maintain that. And now that they have this information, they'll be able to manage those trail segments much more effectively, and maybe provide a little bit more interpretive information in the forest for people who are coming to visit it in the future. And then we also identified a number of archaeological sites along the trail, so adjacent to the trail. And those were all identified and handed over to the Forest Service. Some of them were known, some of them had not been previously identified. So we suggested that they use that information to go back and do additional research in order to see if some of the, especially the farmsteads, the historic components that would have been there when the Cherokee came through in 1838, to see if those sites do in fact go with that time period. I suspect that many of them do not, but there were a few that looked relatively early to me. There wasn't a lot of material on the surface. We weren't digging for this project, so we didn't have shovels with us to see if there was anything else in the ground that could tell us that. But we recommended to them that they do additional testing at those sites. One of our recommendations to them would be to involve a broader community effort in that. I'd like to see Cherokee youth involved in that project in the future. So hopefully something like that can come along down the road. And those sites, because they would be isolated testing, we could do that during the summer months. If Cherokee youth were able to come out for a volunteer opportunity to work on something like that, we could do a little bit of documentation on the trail at that point. So ultimately, for myself, one of the things that I learned during this project is being out there and seeing the trail on the ground kind of made it a little more real for me. I'd seen segments of it in southern Illinois, but to follow out 9 miles of the trail through National Forest, it turned it into something that was a little more than just a metaphor. I think a lot of people in the United States probably recognize the Trail of Tears as more of a symbolic idea about this terrible event in our past, but there's also this physical reminder, this cultural resource that's out there that when you're on the ground, you can walk along it and the past becomes present. You're interacting with it there on a personal level. So I think it's really important that people can come and visit some of those, because it allows us to grapple with some of our history, and for the Cherokee and other indigenous people, these resources are very important to their identity and who they are as a people. So it's important that we maintain them. So I think one of the outcomes of a project like this is providing the physical location of something like that, so people can go and experience that in the landscape and see it on the landscape. Okay. Are there any questions about our research or what we've done? I'd be happy to take questions. Go ahead.
In terms of miles, what is the distance between the two crossings on the Black River?
It's about a mile apart. So they're both kind of in the center of those sections, and a section is 1 mile. So those crossings would be about a mile apart. And I don't know if you could see on the maps, but there's through that section, there's what's called the Old Military Road. That kind of crisscrosses the trail. Portions of that run right along the trail. And what is considered the Old Military Road goes down into that western section where we couldn't go. So that may be something that you could eventually follow out and lead down to where that ferry crossing was.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes?
You said you found about 9 miles of surviving trace of the
Yeah.
old road.
Yeah.
What's from the beginning of that to the end of that?
What's the distance there? I would have to go back to our GIS layer and look. I would guess it's probably closer to about 20 miles based on the distance between Greenville and Poplar Bluff. So, yeah. Around there, roughly. We were able to, so I was in the field for this entire project, and as we drove between different Forest Service parcels, I was able to kind of peek over onto private land, and I can see there are segments that are maintained. So my guess would be throughout this section of southeast Missouri, there are long, intact portions of the trail that are still in relatively good condition, because a lot of that, it's not overly developed in those areas. A lot of that land is pasture. There's not even really a lot of farmland out there where they're plowing. So I would imagine that most of it remains intact today. Yes?
Do you have a large evidence of soil compaction? That is one of your clues you look for when you're identifying the trail?
Yeah, it's difficult in those areas. It's very rocky in that portion of Missouri, especially up on the ridge tops. So what you would see is maybe where soil had been moved to the side of the trail just a little bit, and then rock covered by leaf litter on the surface. We were not shovel testing, so I wasn't taking, samples within the trail, and I wouldn't really even recommend that, probably because you could damage it, leading to extra erosion in the trail if you didn't do it properly. But in the areas on the ridge tops, there's been a lot of erosion during the 20th century in those areas. They clear cut a lot of that for us, and that caused a lot of the soils to run off. So there's not a lot of soil up there to begin with. It's difficult to see, and like I said, the best way to do it is to find the deeper eroded parts of the trail and then kind of walk it back and convince yourself that you're seeing it. Because in certain areas it does get very difficult to see it.
Well, that makes sense because, out on the prairie,
Yeah.
there's still such hard evidence of like the Chisholm Trail and
Yeah.
every other because of the soil compaction. Nothing ever grew again before the soils. Does that make sense for the law?
Yeah, I think in this portion, there's not a lot of undergrowth in the forest there anyway, because they've got a relatively well-maintained, dense forest canopy, and it's pretty rocky, so you don't get a lot of growth anyway, anywhere on the forest floor. Yes?
So, did you find campsites, or did you find homesteads where the Bench Detachment resource food?
Well, there are a number of those that have been identified in Russell Wiseman's research. So we have the locations of a number of those plotted. There weren't any directly associated with Forest Service property, the ones that are in the historic documentation. Now there are sites that I believe to be farmsteads along that trail that may not have a journal entry or may not have a narrative that someone later said, when I was a child, they came through and camped on our property, but they seem to be older farmsteads. So I recommended to the Forest Service that they go back out and check those specifically. So I did locate a number along there, but none that I could link directly to any of the known stopping points or campsites.
Did you attempt to associate landowner names as you went across the trail?
Yeah, so any of those sites, we would go back and look at the plat maps and try to identify who owned the property, look at the original GLO records to see who the original purchasers were. So more of that information will need to be done as they go back to those sites and do additional testing. So for our particular research, we had just done the preliminary identification of where the trail was and then noted the location of these other things. So going a little bit deeper in the archival record to see if we can identify when a farmstead was set up and who owned that property, that would be the next step for those.
Did Vinge leave us journals or invoices?
There's a deposition later where we have some information about where they were coming through, and that was as the Cherokee were trying to get reimbursed for their travel. So there's legal documents related to that, and then there are there's accounts from individuals in the area who were children at the time, who lived in Missouri, who give some information about seeing the Cherokee come across their family's property. So things like that exist, as far as I know. The other types of information, like journal entries from Binge himself, I'm not aware of anything directly related to that portion of Missouri. So,
A comment?
yes.
Question. 8 years ago, we did the pit project.
Yeah, yeah.
And Rusty came and he provided the shake files for
Yeah.
us to do that.
Yeah.
That was the first one. And then there was another, and Denise was on that.
Yeah, there was a college out of St. Louis, I think, that did a small project along there too, unrelated to the passport in time. But yeah, the passport in time work was really kind of our jumping off point for this project. There was a Forest Service archaeologist named Arena Nasa who, Arena had worked for us prior to going to work for the Forest Service. So that's kind of the connection there between us and that area of the forest. And that allowed us to, she provided us with a lot of that documentation that had previously been done, and we sat down and kind of laid out a plan for how we would document the trail. And a lot of it was built off of the work that the Passport in Time volunteers had done, because that was really excellent work. There was a lot of information gathered. There was a lot of people out there working on that project. So it allowed for really good documentation of the trail.
And also at that pit project, that's when we elected Rusty Wiseman, the vice president of the Missouri chapters.
Okay, yeah.
He wasn't in the car that day, so we had our chapter meeting, and
Well, we'd probably still be digging through archival information if it wasn't for Rusty. He did such a good job of going through all of that information that once we read what he had used to develop that line, we were convinced that had to be the route that they took. So all that was left for us to do was go into the field and actually start identifying some of these. The one that you worked on is probably one of the more visible segments. There are certain ones that I really had to kind of crawl through a lot of briars and brambles to get through, you know.
we had a
But
segment like that too.
yeah.
It's still,
I think in some ways that protects the trail, you know, having a lot of overgrowth like that. It's not something you necessarily want everybody out there trying to, you know, ride a four-wheeler on or something like that. So having it back in the...
And one other comment, anyone that's driving back to Oklahoma on US 60, after you leave Poplar Bluff at Poopsville, that's the bend route you're crossing. So, and I know because Rusty told me, and I've been down there twice for that spring with him, down the Plutes. If you turn off at Plutesville and you go just a little bit east and down and follow a road, you're following the bend route. It's real clear. It's really neat.
Yeah. Yes? There is LiDAR for that portion of the state. We have accessed it, and the deeper cuts are visible. I would like to look at it in a little bit more detail in some of the areas where we are seeing very slight reliefs. It shines, that laser light. For those of you who don't know what LiDAR is, it's they fly planes over and they use laser to shoot, to reflect back up to a camera. And that allows them to create a 3D topographic map of the ground surface, and they can kind of peel back the vegetation and see below it. In areas where there's really dense vegetation, sometimes that can obscure things a little bit. You can kind of see like a undulating surface when you look at the LiDAR data, and that's like the canopy of the trees. So in areas where you have a really slight swale, where the trail's coming through, it's kind of hard to see through that. But there may be a way to manipulate the data a little bit more and get a better view. Yeah. 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 Uh-huh. Yeah, I'd be curious to play around with that. Because of the data that we have now, the accuracy of the location of where we saw it on the ground, we could really go back and kind of do a variety of experimental research topics with that. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yes, yeah, and we had that. I didn't show a lot of the hand-drawn maps that we did, but wherever we had that kind of confused braiding of the trail, we would hand draw those locations. Yes, so you can pick that up too, yeah, yeah. Yes, in the back. There are known springs. We did not find any along the way. Rusty has sent me some pictures of springs along the binge route that he is aware of, but none on the properties that we were looking at. So there are locations where they knew to stop because of that, but we didn't happen across any, unfortunately. That would have been exciting, I think. Yes?
Was there a large number of wagons on this, cut these ruts?
Yeah, the problem with interpreting it as just the Cherokee coming through with wagons is that these continued to be used, many portions of this continued to be used probably into the 20th century. So you have people that are, maybe driving like Model Ts and stuff like that on it at the later stages. So interpreting that as a rut that was created by a wagon versus an early automobile or even a later, wagon use of the trail would be difficult. But it's so rocky in that area of the state that unless you're kind of down in the lower areas where there's still some soil, there's not much of a rut, really. It's just a very light swale. You can kind of just barely see it. Helps if it's snowing. Yeah.
So was this trail already there
Yes.
before the Cherokee?
Yes. So the idea, these are well-established routes, and this particular route from Greenville down to the Arkansas border has probably been there for thousands of years. The state road that was put in after 1837, which was surveyed in 1837, that was a well-maintained route from Greenville down to Arkansas. And that, well, actually from Jackson to Greenville and then down to Arkansas. And that particular portion of the trail was maintained and used prior to the Cherokee showing up. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you.